Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Our topic, as you know, is Russian nuclear strategy and conventional inferiority. And our speaker is Kristen van Breusgaard. This is our third opportunity to welcome Kristen to the center as a speaker. She's also been a regular participant in our workshops, whether here at the lab or in Washington, D.C., or even in England. The first time she visited CGSR as a speaker was in 2016, where she set out Russian views on strategic deterrence, bringing home the argument that Russia has done a lot of thinking about the requirements of deterrence and has taken a fairly broad view of the nature of its deterrence strategy. In 2018, she spoke about essentially the security dilemma as it's been playing out in the European landscape, where NATO and Russia have grown stronger, but each perceives itself as less secure. And she invited us to think about the interactions of these adjustments and perceptions and their impact on strategies for reducing nuclear dangers. Today, she'll be summarizing the main arguments in an essay she recently published in the Journal of Strategic Studies, one of the premier journals in our field. This is an essay that was recognized with the distinguished Amos Perlmutter Prize as the best submission by the best submission to the Journal of the Year. The essay examines the relationships between Russian nuclear strategy and its conventional deterrence and warfighting posture. Her work takes a critical view of some of the underpinnings of Trump administration nuclear strategy, particularly the arguments about escalate to de-escalate, and raises timely and important new questions about what the United States and NATO should be doing to reduce nuclear and other dangers in Europe. Dr. van Breusgaard is one of the world's leading experts on Russian military thought, particularly as it relates to strategic deterrence and nuclear strategy. Each time she has talked with us, she has brought important new insights into Russian thinking and their implications for the United States and NATO. She is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Oslo, where she is part of an important new project called the Oslo Nuclear Project. She served previously as a pre-doctoral and then a postdoctoral fellow in nuclear security at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. She served previously also as a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and as a senior analyst in the Norwegian Armed Forces. She has a doctorate in defense studies from King's College London and a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University. Before I turn it to you, Kristen, let me just review the rules of engagement. Kristen will speak for about 45 minutes or so. She'll be using some PowerPoint slides. All of that will be on the record and subsequently posted at our website. But then we'll turn to the Q&A portion. That will be off the record and not recorded. If you would like to join that discussion, please by all means do so. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Either raise your hand electronically when the time comes or simply send me a message in the chat function and I'll make sure that time permitting it gets in front of Kristen. So without further ado, Kristen, let me thank you so much for making the time to do this. Congratulations on your award. We look forward to hearing your remarks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you for this opportunity to come back to CGSR, albeit virtually, to present some of my work. I'm very excited for this discussion. I always receive a lot of good and interesting questions and comments and remarks from this audience, so I'm very much looking forward to your responses. Thank you also, Katie, for facilitating this event. So I'm gonna start sharing some slides. Have I been successful in that endeavor?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, so this article that I have published springs from my work on Russian nuclear strategy and my endeavors to try and understand how and why it has changed over time, that is in the post-Cold War period. And I've been interested in trying to figure out how domestic forces within Russia have shaped strategy formulation and strategy outcomes, including relations between civilian and military authorities in Russia. And I've also been interested in exploring how the external environment and perceptions of the external environment, including perceptions of military threats, have affected nuclear strategy outcomes in Russia. And this took me to what I found to be a pretty striking interrelation between nuclear and conventional capabilities and strategy, and made me interested in how perceived threats and conventional capabilities influenced how Russian strategy evolved over time. So the motivation for this paper, the starting motivation for this paper really was to delve into the way that we understand and interpret nuclear strategy, or the strategy of an adversary. And when I say nuclear strategy, I mean the way in which nuclear weapon states deliberate, communicate, train, and plan for nuclear weapons use, and the way that they would potentially or eventually also use those weapons. Traditionally, we make sense of an adversary's nuclear strategy by observing nuclear indicators. We examine nuclear capabilities to try and decipher, determine what they are for. We observe nuclear signaling, that is, to try and decipher what nuclear weapon states are able to do with their nuclear weapons and what they try to display with their nuclear signaling. And we examine a nuclear declaratory strategy, that is, what nuclear weapon states communicate about the conditions under which they would make use of their nuclear weapons. This latter indicator of nuclear strategy is somewhat more contested than the two others. Some argue that it's not a valid or useful indicator of strategy, as such communicated intentions could change overnight, whereas others hold that what leaders communicate about when they would consider using nuclear weapons may in fact be indicative of the intentions that state leaders have. And since I've been interested in observing or explaining how or if a nuclear strategy changes over time, I've also become particularly interested in how we observe change in that strategy. Do we observe change by observing changes in these nuclear indicators of strategy, or do we observe change by tracing other variables that affect these indicators of strategy? This has for me been a particularly useful point of departure, given the current debate on what the content of Russian nuclear strategy is, which in my mind has paid too little attention to a systematic examination of nuclear strategy and how it's changed over time. So the bottom line of my article called Russian Nuclear Strategy and Conventional Inferiority is that it's not possible to understand the nuclear strategy of states such as Russia without understanding how conventional capabilities interact with nuclear capabilities and nuclear strategy. The article puts forward this theory of nuclear strategy that I call the conventional balance of forces thesis of nuclear strategy, that builds on existing theories about how nuclear weapons can compensate for conventional inferiority. The article demonstrates that Russian perceptions of conventional inferiority, that is, its vulnerability to conventional strikes and the availability of Russia's conventional response options, affects nuclear strategy choices that Russia has made. And it demonstrates that as conventional capabilities have improved, Russian nuclear strategy, or strategy for using nuclear weapons to affect the course of conflict, has changed. and that the point in conflict at which Russia would have to or will consider resorting to nuclear weapons has been pushed back as a result of improved conventional capabilities. This does not mean that Russia does no longer rely on nuclear options to deter and to defeat significant threats. Russia still does, but it's no longer reliant on nuclear options in conflicts that do not threaten the very existence of the states. Conventional force improvements have augmented the role of nuclear weapons in Russian strategy for managing the escalation of crisis. And the threat to use nuclear weapons only in conflicts that threaten state existence becomes more credible as a result of this expanded range of options, including nuclear options, including conventional options. So the key contributions that this article then makes by examining Russian strategy through this thesis are, first of all, that it overcomes what I think are some shortcomings of existing works on Russian nuclear strategy that tend to conflate older and newer indicators of nuclear strategy. Typically, they draw on strategy debates from the 1990s and on doctrinal content from the 1990s and pair this up with the way that Russia's nuclear capabilities have been developed recently. I examine both how Russian strategy has evolved over time and also examine or try to explain why it has changed in this way. Secondly, this article updates existing theories about the relationship between conventional nuclear forces and their deterrent and warfighting utility, and sheds particular light on how Russia theorizes and deliberates about this. And thirdly, I demonstrate that Russia is not necessarily a unique nuclear actor that must be treated as a sui generis. We tend to analyze Russian nuclear strategy as a separate, as a very separate case, and tend to assume that Russian nuclear intentions are very particular or do not resemble those of other nuclear weapon states. I demonstrate that Russian strategy does resemble that of many other nuclear weapon states who seek to compensate for conventional inferiority, while I also produce or provide some additional nuance with regard to what aspects of Russian nuclear strategy are in fact unique to the Russian case. So what is the existing landscape in this domain? The existing works in this domain deal with, first of all, how to make use of nuclear threats to deter conventional aggression, which of course has been intrinsic to nuclear theorizing and strategizing since the inception of nuclear weapons. Bernard Brodie, of course, as we all know, talked about the threat value of nuclear weapons being truly unique, and so that they were uniquely able to deter also conventional aggression. Later in the Cold War, limited war theorists made arguments about limited nuclear options and how they would be more credible for deterring conventional aggression. If a nuclear weapon state faced conventional inferiority, that it would be able to use nuclear weapons to compensate for that inferiority, for deterrent purposes, for escalation management purposes, as well as for warfighting purposes. And after the Cold War, other theorists such as Vipin Orang have continued to theorize about the deterrent utility of promising rapid nuclear escalation in the face of conventional inferiority. These theories about nuclear compensation for conventional inferiority tend to rest on two implicit assumptions, however. First, that a state that faces conventional inferiority will choose nuclear compensation and that it will stick to this choice. It doesn't really, these theories don't really account for future strategy choices, and they don't really explain how a state facing this dilemma will orient its forces into the future. Will the state continue to focus on prioritizing resources toward nuclear capabilities, or will it start channeling resources towards conventional forces? What happens to the nuclear strategy of this state if that state improves its conventional forces? And importantly, will all states facing this conventional inferiority dilemma choose the same? Secondly, these theories also tend to assume that if states will prefer nuclear deterrence, then they must be relatively confident in the possibility of controlling escalation. But again, there is reason to believe that there is some variation across different states with regard to their palette for what risk to assume or tolerate with regard to the potential of tolerating of controlling escalation. So to overcome these shortcomings, or to challenge these implicit assumptions in these existing theories about conventional inferiority, I put forward this conventional balance of forces thesis that posits that changes in conventional threats and conventional capabilities produce change in nuclear strategy. And I presume that if this were the case, we would expect to see evidence that perceived conventional inferiority would correlate with enhanced nuclear threats and an emphasis on limited nuclear options. I focus on primarily on non-strategic nuclear weapons, because those are the primary option for threatening the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons is the primary option for compensating for conventional inferiority, or for matching or meeting a conventional threat. And we would also expect to see evidence that an improved conventional capability would correlate with reduced nuclear threats and reduced emphasis on limited nuclear options. And there are a couple of possible cases that seem to indicate that this thesis could be true, one being a NATO strategy in the 1980s that, at least to some extent, started emphasizing conventional force improvements. Another candidate would be contemporary Chinese nuclear strategy that or Chinese strategy in general that tends to emphasize conventional deterrence, perhaps to a greater, even to a greater extent than nuclear deterrence. And then Russia, which is the case that I will examine in greater detail. And I mentioned the article, and I'd like to mention here as well that it seems to me that the case of Pakistan remains as an outlier with regard to this thesis, because that is one nuclear weapon state that seemed to sit comfortably with its enhanced nuclear reliance, and that doesn't really seem to poised to or set on improving its conventional capabilities. But there may be people in the audience who know much more about this than me. So to the Russian case then, which is what I examine in this article. I examined in this article, I examined three cases or periods of Russian nuclear strategy, starting with 2000, going through 2010, and then to 2014 through 2020. And for each case, I examine the perceived Russian vulnerability to conventional threats as expressed by Russian military theorists and in official documents and in official statements. I examined the available conventional response options for each period and how these evolved. And then I examined indicators of nuclear strategy, the ones that I have already mentioned, that is nuclear capabilities with an emphasis on non-strategic nuclear weapons, nuclear signaling. With regard to nuclear capabilities and nuclear signaling, I base my analysis primarily on Western sources, because these are comparable over time with regard to publications issued by Western outlets that compare the evolution in Russian nuclear arsenals. I also make use of some Russian sources. And then finally, I examine declaratory strategy and the debates that precede changes in declaratory strategy based on primarily Russian sources. So moving to the first case that I examine, Russian nuclear strategy around the millennial shift. This first case demonstrates how Russian perceptions of conventional vulnerability and a lack of response options produced an emphasis on early nuclear use in this period. The Russian military and civilian leadership in this period perceived an enhanced threat from the conventional precision strike capabilities of the West, as demonstrated, for example, in the NATO Kosovo operation. And this led the Russian General Staff to simulate conventional strikes against the strategic forces in the Far East, and where these simulations demonstrated to the Russian General Staff that in the first 3 days of conflict, and a potential adversary armed with conventional precision-guided munitions would be able to destroy 25% of the strategic forces. And the Kosovo intervention had really sort of brought home this potential threat to the Russian leadership, both the technical capability of potentially destroying at least parts of the Russian retaliatory potential in a short period of time, but also the Western political will to unseat regimes that they were not happy with. And for Russia in this period, the conventional response options that would be available in the face of such an attack were extremely dire. This was a period when the Russian military was in a desperately dire situation, and this produced a significant debate. This threat in particular produced a significant debate in Moscow with regard to whether to prioritize nuclear or conventional modernization. Russia evidently also facing a number of other security threats in this period, including the war in Chechnya. So the nuclear strategy outcomes that we see in this period is that the Russian Security Council by 1997 and in 1998 was tasked with revising Russian nuclear strategy. And this over a prolonged process, and this resulted in some key decisions with regard to first modernizing nuclear capabilities and crucially to retain a full nuclear triad, which was a big question in this period. Not everyone expected Russia to retain a full nuclear triad, and particularly the air leg of the triad was questioned by a number of analysts and scholars. And Russia also decided to improve their non-strategic nuclear capabilities. And the deliberations that preceded this included discussions about non-strategic nuclear weapons and their use for regional war scenarios. And I've included on this slide a quote from one of the journal articles that deliberates these scenarios and the reasoning regarding how nuclear weapons could serve this purpose. And this is the period when also the idea or the term of nuclear de-escalation actually emerges in the Russian military literature, with this one article from 1999 written by Levshin and other military theorists who put forward this theory about escalating to de-escalate. And in this period, we also see increased signaling of a credible first use threat, at least compared to what we had seen then in during the 1990s, which had not had this level of signaling. So Russia conducted in 1999, as far as I know, their first strategic exercise since the end of the Cold War, Zapad 1999, in which they simulated strikes with nuclear-armed cruise missiles against targets in Norway and in the United States, according to open sources. And the Russian defense minister at the time, Sergeyev, explained publicly why Russia carried out this kind of demonstration, and I've included also a part of his public statement on this in the slide as well. So really he spells out why or the need for Russia to demonstrate this first use threat. And declaratory strategy in this period also conveys a lowered nuclear threshold, where the military doctrine that was issued in 2000 was revised or had been revised as a result of this process in the Security Council that I mentioned. And the doctrine now stating and changing the formulation regarding nuclear weapons use, and now stating that Russia could use nuclear weapons in situations that were critical to national security. So a very broad and general formulation that could encompass a range of scenarios. So this case, first case, largely validates that perceived conventional inferiority, that is a perceived threat from potential adversaries' conventional capabilities combined with a lack of conventional response options produce a greater reliance on nuclear threats and efforts to make such threats credible. The second case that I examine is then 2010, a case where the prospect of improved conventional capabilities are starting to reduce Russia's emphasis on early nuclear use. With regard to conventional vulnerabilities in this period, they are still worrisome as from the as from the Russian perspective. We see in 2010 in the Russian military doctrine issued in 2010 that this document for the first time describes Western deployments of high precision conventional systems as a military danger to Russian security. And there are also increased Russian concerns about a European ballistic missile defense or a NATO missile defense deployment, in part because of this reliance on limited nuclear response options to conventional threats that I just discussed, as had been apparent from 2000 onwards. So that meant that even if European ballistic missile defense or US ballistic missile defense capability would not be able to defend against the entirety of the Russian nuclear arsenal, the fact or the problem that they could be able to defend against a first and limited nuclear strike was posing problems to the doctrinal basis of how Russia conceived of making use of their nuclear weapons, and undermined then this new way of deterring conventional threats with limited nuclear strikes. Conventional capabilities were by this time looking to improve at least the large-scale modernization of the Russian armed forces, both nuclear and conventional, had started from 2008 onwards, and the state armaments program, the first really big modernization program, was launched in 2010. So by now there are at least these concrete plans to and work to modernize conventional precision strike capabilities, as well as to modernize air and missile defense capabilities. But we're still some way away from actually deployed systems that are part of a crisis management inventory, but there are a couple of systems that are beginning to come online, and you see at least the contours of the future Russian improved conventional force. So what's the effect of this potential and starting conventional modernization on nuclear strategy? With regard to capabilities, there is a reduction in the overall numbers of substrategic nuclear capabilities, at least according to Russian official statements. But there is also this modernization of substrategic nuclear capabilities alongside conventional options. So we see the deployment of the land-based Iskander missile. We see the development of the Caliber as well as the KH-101. And with the benefit of hindsight, we also know, or it seems as if the decision with regard to an intermediate range land-based missile must have been taken sometime in this period, sometime before or around this. So as Russia plans to produce all these conventional options, they're also modernizing nuclear options alongside them. There is still not a sufficient non-nuclear capability to reduce reliance on existing nuclear capabilities. With regard to signaling, we see definitely an increased pace of strategic nuclear operations, at least as reported in Western media, and the habitual reporting is that this significantly increases from 2007, 2008 onwards. And there is also signaling with non-strategic nuclear capabilities. We have the incident with the Akula sub in 2009, and there is the Zapad incident in 2009, including Polish reactions and interpretations with regard to this. And there is the issue now already with regard to interpreting such incidents and the significance of them, of the incidents that involve dual use capabilities. At least in 2010, there is a limited number of conventional options from which to choose to signal an emphasis on conventional rather than nuclear assets. And with regard to declaratory strategy, there is this new doctrine that was published in 2010 that seems to increase the threshold for nuclear use and includes this formulation about how Russia will use nuclear weapons only when the very existence of the state is under threat, as I've included on the slide. And there is, of course, a room for interpretation with regard to this this formulation, the very existence of the state. But there is some important nuance and difference with if we compare it to the 2000 military doctrine, including in light of the contemporary debates that were taking place at the time about a potential Russian intervention, for example, in the Baltic states to protect Russian minorities there. If you remember, this was, of course, right after the war in Georgia, and Russia had also made some law amendments in 2009, I think, with regard to the deployment of military force abroad without parliamentary approval in order to protect the rights of Russian citizens abroad. So this produced this very significant debate within NATO about whether whether Russia would deploy forces to the Baltic states to conduct such operations. This new formulation in the 2010 military doctrine with regard to nuclear employment seemed to signify that at a very minimum, it would require attacks on Russian territory proper before Russia would consider using nuclear weapons in response. In sum, the 2010 case goes some way in validating a reduced emphasis on nuclear threats with regard to declaratory strategy, but not necessarily with regard to the capabilities, because we see this combined evolution of conventional and non-strategic nuclear capability development. So the real test is really the next case where Russia's conventional capabilities are actually starting to come online. So in the paper, this next case comprises 2014 through 2020, although I've divided it into two slides here. So in this case, the bottom line is that conventional advances have started to influence Russian nuclear threats, but declaratory threats, but less so Russian nuclear capabilities. The conventional threat that Russia is facing in this period evidently has increased as a result primarily of Russia's own actions in Ukraine, which in turn has produced an enhanced NATO presence and deployment on Russia's periphery along its entire periphery, including in the Barents Sea region, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea region. And the conventional response options that are now available to Russia or becoming available are starting to substantially improve, including the deployment of sea and air-launched cruise missiles, the later deployment of air-launched ballistic missiles, land-based intermediate-range missiles, although Russia is still lagging in numbers and in quantitative terms if they compare themselves to Western states. And they've also improved air and missile defense capabilities that in turn improve their own ability to deter conventional aggression. At least this is the way that the Russian theorists themselves describe it. The nuclear strategy outcomes that we see are, with regard to capabilities, a range of dual-use capabilities now, both land, sea, and air-based. The Russian case demonstrates this non-linear relationship between conventional capabilities and nuclear strategy that is not predicted by this thesis. We are seeing an improvement on conventional capabilities, but that is associated with enhanced nuclear options for all of those platforms. So the Russian case demonstrates this unique feature of Russian strategy and Russian nuclear strategy deliberations, where the utility of nuclear threats change in character because of because these dual-use systems provide a tool to change the deterrent dynamic and help manage escalation. And I've included a quote from one of the articles that deals with this topic for an illustration. So we see now really the refinement of this Russian concept of strategic deterrence that places great emphasis on the deterrent value of conventional but dual capable systems that lend credibility to nuclear options, and where the nuclear options lend credibility to the conventional options. With regard to signaling, strategic signaling seems to be increasing throughout the 2010s, at least according to Western sources. There is the problem or possibility of signaling both with regard to these dual-use platforms, depending, of course, a bit on who it is that is observing these capabilities, and this seems to be some cause of confusion. But there are also a couple of elements of dogs, or examples of dogs that didn't bark, a subdued nuclear element in the Zapad 2013 and 17 exercises. And there is the issue of the dynamic nature of signaling and comparing of NATO numbers and Russian numbers on the other side's activity. With regard to declaratory strategy, the military doctrine of 2010 only really had one nuclear novelty, which was to introduce the concept of non-nuclear strategic deterrence, which is, and I quote, a complex of foreign policy, military and military technical measures directed at the prevention of non-nuclear aggression against Russia. And this is combined with repeated statements from high-level officials about Russia's intent to reduce their reliance on nuclear options once more conventional options are available, that is, at some distant or potential point in the future. And then in 2010, we have the publication of this new deterrence document, the main elements of the Russian Federation state policy on nuclear deterrence, previously only a classified document. That is, a classified document with this title has been produced both in 1999 and in 2010. We, of course, don't know whether the content of those classified documents in fact resembled this or not, but certainly the publication of this document was somewhat sensational, in part because of the debate in the Western analytical community with regard to the content of the classified versions of this document. And this document just really reiterates the message that had been conveyed in military doctrines also across this period that I'm analyzing, at least the latter part, reiterating that Russian nuclear weapons are weapons of last resort. It includes some details with regard to what constitutes state existence. And it also includes this formulation about how the time, place, and system of Russian nuclear first use should surprise the adversary, which also sheds some light on the utility of this range of dual capable systems that the Russians are developing or deploying. By 2020, to Russian strategists, it seems as if the conventional threats are still pressing, even if Russia's conventional options are improving. But this seems to produce a high declaratory threshold for nuclear use. That is, that the threshold for nuclear use, the declaratory threshold for nuclear use, remains the same as it has been then from 2010 and onwards until today. There is the question of Russian nuclear signaling and the problems with trying to sort of measure the activity with regard to this. The problem of deciphering signaling that includes non-strategic nuclear weapons and dual capable platforms. At least we can conclude that there is a different type of signaling than what we saw in the 2000 case, or the period when Russia explicitly conveyed this first use threat. That we are not seeing that in this period, but we are seeing that some strategic nuclear capabilities are being developed apace, and that Russian theorists and strategists and doctrine retains this emphasis on nuclear weapons as an escalation management tools in regional wars that do threaten a state existence. So despite these improved conventional capabilities, there isn't really a significant reduction of the role of nuclear weapons since 2010. There is a significant reduction since 2000, but not since 2010, rather preservation of the changed role that they have in Russian strategy, pushing back the timing conflict when Russia will need to resort to the nuclear option. And this ever-expanding range of conventional or non-nuclear deterrence options provides Russia with broader or more tools for crisis management. And there is, of course, also the sustained communication from Russian leaders and in official documents about how nuclear weapons remain weapons of last resort, and this reiteration that the Western interpretation of Russian strategy as one of escalate to de-escalate is not Russian nuclear strategy. So to sum up, this conventional balance of forces thesis contributes to demonstrating first how nuclear weapons did compensate for conventional inferiority in Russian strategy when conventional response options have been severely lacking, but also contributes to demonstrating how Russia has pursued conventional escalation management options since the identification of this solution and the evolution really of this solution and the way in which it interacts with nuclear deterrence options. Furthermore, it demonstrates how in the Russian case, there isn't really this clear substitution effect, rather there is an augmentation effect of conventional weapons that make, according to Russian strategists, the nuclear first use or the threat of nuclear first use in situations that threaten state survival more credible, precisely because more conventional options lend credibility to the actual threat of using nuclear weapons in situations that are so dire where this is warranted, and where the nuclear options lend credibility to the range of conventional response options and make those deterrent threats more credible and more effective in the face of an adversary. Russia still conceives of non-strategic nuclear capabilities as a tool for managing escalation and for influencing the course of conflict, and it states explicitly that it would use nuclear weapons as a means of last resort when its conventional options are exhausted. But Russian nuclear use, in my interpretation, would not convey confidence that it could not, that it would not incur further escalation, but rather a willingness to risk such escalation when all other options have been exhausted. And to sum up, and the implications of this these findings really suggest that there are some significant gaps in existing debates and theories about how conventional nuclear forces and strategy interact and how we should understand or interpret nuclear strategy. The Russian case, first of all, demonstrates this novel type of interaction of conventional nuclear capabilities and as far as I can understand, unique Russian thinking about this iterative deterrent utility of such tools. That also means that a different nuclear weapon states with a different conventional nuclear mix and where the relationship with an adversary's conventional nuclear mix looks different may produce different nuclear strategy outcomes. The point being that the relationship between the conventional nuclear balance of forces can be dynamic and change over time. Secondly, this argument or evidence highlights the need, I think, to examine in much greater detail the strategic utility of dual-use capabilities as seen by different nuclear weapon states, including non-Western states. Western debates have tended to focus on the entanglement problems that these capabilities entail or produce. This lens forces a somewhat different or produces different insights with regard to how some states actually conceive of strategic utility in these dual capable systems. Thirdly, this argument or this evidence highlights also a need to explore the interactive conventional nuclear nexus between adversaries and how that affects nuclear strategy outcomes. So understanding how nuclear and conventional capabilities and response options and the relationship between two adversaries and their nuclear and conventional capabilities and response options, I think, will be central to understanding when in conflict an adversary might consider using nuclear weapons and to understand what types of actions may trigger nuclear escalation. To put it simply or not so simply, understanding that is the adversary's perception of what we will be able to do to them also by conventional means is crucial and will be crucial to understanding what may trigger unwanted nuclear escalation and to understanding what will trigger inevitable escalation. So I think I'm going to stop there and look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you, Kristen. That was a tour de force. Covered a lot of ground. Very interesting. Thank you.